The computer BIOS, you may know it as just that screen that comes up before the computer boots into the operating system. Of course, there is a little bit more to it, and you may also know that you can actually update the BIOS. Usually the motherboard or computer manufacturer will have the update files on their website. But there are some potentially big risks involved in updating the BIOS, which is what this video is about. We're going to go over, is it really necessary to update the BIOS? Is it worth it considering these risks? And I'm also going to do a live demo of what will happen if things could potentially go wrong. I literally bought a cheap old laptop off of eBay kind of as a sacrifice to show you. So first of all, what exactly is the BIOS? Well, it stands for Basic Input-Output System, but that alone is not very helpful. But essentially, it's a very low-level software that is first run when the computer powers on. More specifically, it's not just an interface, but also the firmware for the computer. The BIOS activates all your hardware and also runs the operating system's bootloader, and the bootloader being essentially a small piece of code on the hard drive that the BIOS knows how to read and tells it how to start up the operating system, and then after the operating system starts up, it takes over, and the BIOS doesn't really do much else. You can access the BIOS settings usually by pressing a specific key that's going to vary depending on the motherboard or computer manufacturer, but if you just let the computer start up by itself without pressing anything, the BIOS will typically just do a check that all the hardware is working, and then it'll do what's called a power on self-test or post, and then if you see this, it means it's all good, and it's going to then load the boot record and lets the OS take it from there. So really, again, the BIOS only handles stuff right after the computer turns on. Now, that being said, these days, BIOS is not really actually a thing anymore. It's been replaced by the newer generation you could think it of, which is the UEFI, and that stands for Unified Extensible Firmware Interface. But colloquially, most people still just refer to the UEFI as the BIOS anyway, and even on computer manufacturers' websites, if you go and search for the download files, they'll still call it the BIOS update, just for less confusion. Most people know it as the BIOS, so that's what they just call it anyway. UEFI, you can mostly just think of it as like a next generation of BIOS, even though technically it does kind of work a lot differently, but it has a lot more features and can do more stuff, like it supports larger hard drives that it can boot from, it's typically faster, it has much fancier interface, it can look like a graphic user interface, can support mouse, all sorts of stuff that BIOS couldn't. So basically, anytime in this video I say BIOS, really I'm referring to the UEFI, but BIOS is a lot easier to say. Now, you might be wondering where the BIOS is stored, and it's actually not on a hard drive or anything. It has its own physical dedicated chip on the motherboard where it's located. And you can actually see it on this HP laptop that I got that I opened up and found it on here. This is what it looks like on this computer at least. Now, the settings for the BIOS though are usually stored separately on its own chip called a CMOS chip, and actually the CMOS chip needs to be constantly powered to store the data. So usually you're gonna have what's called a CMOS battery, which is just a basic button cell battery on the motherboard as well. And if you take out the CMOS battery, it essentially is a way to hard reset the settings for the BIOS, but the BIOS itself stays on there, but you can reset the settings by taking out that battery. Though strangely, for some reason, this HP laptop does not actually have a CMOS battery. I see the place where it is, and I found the documentation where it shows this is where it would be on some other models, but for some reason, this one just doesn't have it. So I guess in this case, it's stored somewhere else. Just be aware that it might not necessarily have a CMOS battery in every single computer. Now, one more thing to point out is even though I said the settings are stored on the CMOS chip, actually modern UEFI has its own dedicated partition, typically on the main hard drive or SSD, and it's called the EFI partition, usually around 100 megabytes. And this is going to contain stuff like bootloaders for the different operating systems, certain drivers, system utilities, error logs, basically just some stuff that might need to be run before the operating system loads. This stuff is not 100% necessary to boot the computer, but it might be necessary to successfully boot the operating system. So that partition is important. So now that we know some of the basics of BIOS and UEFI, let's talk about updating. You can update the BIOS/UEFI, again, usually by downloading the files off of the computer manufacturer's website. And what this will do is actually rewrite that physical chip on the motherboard to contain the new firmware and the updated version of the BIOS. Though, as you can imagine, this does have some risks, because if something goes wrong and the BIOS is corrupted to the point of not working, then it means you not only can't just boot into an operating system, but you can't boot the computer at all, because the BIOS is the thing that does the booting even to the hard drives. So you can't even create a rescue CD and boot from a backup CD or backup hard drive or anything like that. Like if Windows were corrupted, you could just maybe wipe the hard drive or boot from a CD. No, the BIOS is what does all that, so if the BIOS is corrupted, you're kind of screwed. So for the rest of the video, we can talk about how likely this is to happen, what would cause it to happen, and also what recourse you might have if something does go wrong updating the BIOS, because there are potentially a few things you could do. So let me go over what the physical update process is for the actual chip. Basically, the BIOS, again, is going to be stored on its own chip called a SPI chip, typically Serial Peripheral Interface. At least that's from my understanding. There might be other types as well, especially in older versions. But basically, these little chips don't hold much, usually around 16 megabytes or so, but they could be up to even 128 megabytes. And they don't need to be big though, because the downloaded firmware file is only going to be around a few megabytes. For example, on my Asus motherboard from my main computer, it's around 8 megabytes. And I also found the spec sheet for the BIOS chip on that HP laptop, and it says that it's 8192 kilobytes. From what I've read, typically the writing speed on a BIOS chip is going to be around somewhere like 100 kilobytes per second. I don't know how accurate that is, but it sounds about right. And that's important because considering how big the average BIOS firmware file is and how big the usual SPI chip is going to be, that usually means the actual update process could take around a few minutes on average. And that's important to know because you can kind of assess the risk based on, is my computer likely to crash or maybe lose power within any given 5-minute time frame? Maybe if the power in your neighborhood is really unreliable, or maybe your computer crashes all the time, then that 5 minutes might be a pretty long time and not worth the risk of even updating, because there's a good chance it could happen during the update. So the next thing to talk about is updating the BIOS really even necessary? And I definitely think for most people, the answer is no. Like I said, the BIOS really only handles things right after the computer starts and just handles some basic boot up stuff. But most people never even see the rest of the BIOS or even care to change the settings in there. So it's not like updating the BIOS is going to add any features that you're going to notice while using the computer and the operating system or anything. And even if you are someone who maybe has changed some settings in the BIOS, maybe to overclock the computer, typically all that same feature is going to be available in the stock BIOS that came with the computer. BIOS updates are usually pretty small and incremental. So it might include things like stability updates or bug fixes, or occasionally it might add hardware compatibility. And in that case, unless you really have a specific reason to update the BIOS, maybe your computer is very unstable and there's a BIOS update specifically to address that issue, or maybe if you do have a new piece of hardware you bought to put in and the BIOS update specifically is required to support that piece of hardware, then you might actually do need to do an update. But otherwise, if there's no need to do an update, don't do it. One example is you can see for my motherboard, there was a BIOS update in 2015, which added support for NVMe drives and 5th generation Intel CPUs. Now, I actually do have NVMe drives in there now that I didn't when I first bought it, so I had updated since then, so that was okay, but if I didn't have that BIOS version, I would have had to install that update to be able to use those drives. Occasionally, though, BIOS updates may also include security updates. For example, when that major CPU vulnerability was found for Intel, it required a BIOS update to update like the microcode for the CPU to fix that vulnerability. And that is one case where, all right, for security, you might have to do the update, even though it's not necessarily going to add any features or anything. But again, really the only reason to update the BIOS is if there is a specific reason to do so and you know what that is. But don't just update the BIOS thinking it's going to make any difference. If there's nothing wrong with your computer, you're not going to notice any benefit. So as for the risks of updating the BIOS, I kind of already touched on this, but if things go wrong, like the BIOS gets corrupted while being written to and then you restart the computer, it could potentially be catastrophic. And like I said, because the BIOS is what really first starts up and starts up all the hardware, if it gets corrupted and doesn't work anymore, then there's literally nothing you can do with the computer, at least most of the time, which I'll get to in a second. As for what could cause the BIOS to become corrupted, there's probably two main categories. First is if the BIOS update is interrupted while it's writing to the chip. So this could typically be from power loss. The computer turns off for whatever reason while the updating is being written. Or if you're running the update using an update tool within Windows, then maybe an antivirus program will kick in and be overzealous and interrupt and stop that process while it's writing to the BIOS. Or maybe some other program could interrupt it somehow, or maybe Windows itself will crash while that update is going. Now, the other main thing that is probably less common, but also possible, is if you install the wrong BIOS. You install the wrong version of the BIOS, maybe it's for other hardware, and obviously that BIOS is not really gonna work on your specific hardware, could definitely cause issues or does not work at all. Now, I don't want to scare you too much because the next main thing we're going to talk about is that sometimes there are some methods you can use to recover the BIOS, but it's going to depend on your computer and your hardware. One example is some motherboards have what's called a dual BIOS, either two separate chips or maybe one chip split into two, and it literally has two copies of the BIOS installed on it that you can switch between by pressing a button or flipping a switch. For example, on my computer, it's an Asus motherboard, there is a button on it labeled BIOS switch, and by pressing it, it can switch to a sort of backup copy of a BIOS in case the first one gets corrupted. Alternatively, or maybe in addition to the BIOS switch, your computer may also have a recovery tool of some kind. So this may be, for example, I'm assuming some kind of extra separate chip that detects if the BIOS is not booting correctly, and then it switches to boot to this little chip that can install the BIOS and rewrite it using, for example, a backup copy that might be stored on a hard drive or something, or a USB you can insert. And you will see an example of this later. The important thing to know though is before doing any kind of BIOS update, always look up what recovery methods for the BIOS are available to you in your specific computer. If it's a custom built computer, then you're probably gonna have to look it up for that specific motherboard model, or if it's a pre-built computer or a laptop, then usually you just look it up for that specific model. And if you find out that your computer doesn't really have that much in terms of options for BIOS recovery, then you really have to consider, is it necessary to update the BIOS? Do I really need to do this for a specific reason, or do I just kind of want to have the latest BIOS update? Might not be worth it if the risks are involved and you don't have any way to recover the BIOS if it goes wrong. And like I said, it's really gonna depend on your specific computer or motherboard, but what I'll do is let's go over some of the major computer brands and what they advertise as being their recovery options across most of their models. And then what I'll do is I'll do a specific example using the HP laptop that I bought. I'm gonna purposely corrupt the BIOS and then try to recover it. First of all, we have HP. It seems like they do have a BIOS recovery tool on most of their computers, and usually this involves pressing the Windows key and B or V while the computer is booting up, and then that opens up a automatic recovery tool for the BIOS, and if there's a previous version of the BIOS stored on it, then it will automatically recover that and rewrite the BIOS, or you might be able to do it via a USB. Next we have Lenovo, which from what I've read, apparently does have on most of their models a not so well documented method for recovering the BIOS, which involves downloading the BIOS files off their website, then formatting a USB drive in a certain way, and then pressing a key combination on startup. Again, this isn't really advertised anywhere. I basically just read about it on random forums, people saying you can do this. So basically the best thing you're gonna do is Google Lenovo and then your specific model and then BIOS recovery to see if any people on forums have been talking about it. It's really not well documented, so just something to be aware of. Next up we have Dell, which in my opinion has one of the best help pages describing the availability of the BIOS recovery tool on their different models. And it seems like all Dell computers released after December 2015 have a BIOS recovery option, and it also specifically lists the models supporting it before then. So what I like about this is it's very easy to find out exactly if your computer has a BIOS recovery option and how to access it if it's a Dell. And as described here, usually it's going to require holding some kind of key combo on boot up, and the recovery tool may already be on the computer, or you may just have to load it onto a USB and it can boot from there, but most Dell computers appear to have some kind of option. Next up for Asus, or Asus, I always forget how to pronounce it, it does seem like at least some or maybe even most of their computers and motherboards do have some kind of recovery mode. However, you're gonna have to specifically look up your individual model of your device to find out if it does for that or not. Like I mentioned, it might have a dual BIOS on the motherboard like mine is, even though my motherboard is pretty old. It's from 2014, it's a Rampage 5 Extreme. But also some motherboards may have a feature called flashback, where you can plug in the USB with the files on it into a dedicated port on the back of the motherboard, and then if it needs to, it can recover by reading right off that USB drive, and then there's a button you press on the back to initiate the transfer and rewrite it. What I've also read is apparently you can actually send in as like a last resort your hardware into Asus, and they will physically reflash the chip or maybe even replace the chip for you, although that probably does have some costs involved. All that being said though, what do you do if your BIOS is corrupted and there is no actual tool to use for recovering it? Well, you do actually have a few options, though they might not be that ideal. First, you might be able to send the device to the manufacturer, and then they could either reflash it using special tools by literally, attaching clips and stuff to the chip and rewriting it that way, or they might just replace the BIOS chip altogether. Next, you could try to replace the BIOS chip yourself if you can manage to get your hands on one. From what I've seen on eBay, apparently there are sellers who they kind of specialize in this. You search the name of the motherboard that you have or your computer and then BIOS chip, and there are some sellers that claim to sell pre-programmed BIOS chips, and then you just have to be able to desolder the old one off and resolder the new one on. Of course, you would have to be comfortable doing that. Or third, you could try to manually reflash the BIOS chip yourself, though this is probably going to be a little bit complicated, and it's going to require like third-party software, probably a special cable, I think it's called an SPI cable, that you literally hook up to parts of the leads of the BIOS, and then the third-party software can rewrite to it. For example, the software I came across was called SPI-GM. Again, this is probably for super advanced users and not very user-friendly, not exactly plug and play. Finally, I've also seen some so-called BIOS programmer chips and kits that you can buy off like Amazon, and this apparently involves physically taking off the chip, again, off the motherboard, desoldering it, putting it into this programmer thing, and then it will rewrite the BIOS to that chip. And then of course you do need some software to be able to do that. So again, none of this for do-it-yourself is exactly easy. So unless you're a super advanced user, your best bet is still to use the official recovery tool that might be authored for your computer or device, or just maybe send it in and not worry about it. All right, so now we can get to the part you've probably been waiting for. I'm gonna show you a real-life demo of what might happen if you corrupt the BIOS. So what I have here is an HP Stream 14-inch laptop. It's apparently from 2017, so not exactly super old or anything. And the BIOS update for these laptops can be downloaded from HP's website and then can be installed in a few ways. One can be using a Windows version of the tool, so it'll update the BIOS right from within Windows, or alternatively, it can be done from outside of Windows by you go into the BIOS settings and run it from there. And I usually do prefer to install BIOS updates from outside of Windows using the BIOS settings pre-boot, because it means there's not going to be any risk of Windows crashing or any programs interfering with it, no antivirus interrupting it or anything like that. Of course, there are still some risks of doing it this way. For example, power loss is still going to be an issue possibly, or if it somehow writes something wrong or the process of writing goes wrong, I don't know. But it's just less so. I think less stuff can go wrong than if you're using Windows. So I looked up the different key combos to use on boot, and apparently there's one that's separate from BIOS settings for using startup settings or something. So I went to that, and then I navigated to where you do the BIOS firmware update, selected the USB drive, and then let it go. And as you can see, it really started off slow, not writing very fast at all, but eventually it did kind of speed up. So I would have estimated this probably would have taken maybe no more than a couple minutes if I had let it go completely. But after it was going, I tried to interrupt it in a few ways. For example, I tried pressing escape to maybe exit the program. I tried pressing the power button, but I'm assuming they had some safeguards built in to prevent you from doing that and interrupting it on purpose. So finally, I was able to just kind of unplug the laptop. I guess the battery was so degraded or not charged enough where it just shut off immediately after unplugging it. So perfectly, right in the middle of the update, good for the demonstration. And now when I tried booting up the laptop, it was pretty much bricked. There was no post. It didn't boot anything really. However, like I said, HP devices, including this one, does have a built-in BIOS recovery tool. So let's try it. Now, this is kind of funny because this was going to be the part of the video where I showed you how if you have a BIOS recovery tool on your computer, you don't have to worry as much because you can just use that to fix any corrupted BIOS, but things didn't exactly go as planned. I used the BIOS tool from HP's website, which also allows you to create a BIOS recovery USB. And the idea is you do this on another computer and then you insert that USB into the computer and then hold down a certain key combo while powering on the computer. And then presumably whatever recovery tool they have, which I'm assuming is some kind of separate chip from the BIOS so it can boot even without the BIOS, starts up after detecting that the BIOS is corrupted. And then it uses the backup copy of the BIOS stored on the USB and then rewrites the BIOS with it. Except in this case, it didn't. I was able to get the BIOS recovery tool to start. It booted up, it was on the screen and everything, but after saying initializing, it just goes to a black screen and dies again. It wasn't actually doing the recovery process. And I literally tried doing a bunch of different stuff for several hours with no success. I found that when no USB drive was inserted, it does also boot to the same recovery screen. It does like a countdown while saying that no BIOS recovery was found. And I believe in this case, if no USB is inserted, it instead looks on the EFI partition on the hard drive. So I figured, all right, you know what I can try is opening up the computer, taking out the hard drive, plugging it into another computer, maybe inserting those files onto that EFI partition where the recovery files are located, and then when I put it back in, it'll be able to find those files and use that to recover instead of the USB. But when I opened it up, I found that the internal drive is not an actual hard drive you can take out. It's just a flash chip actually soldered on to the motherboard. So that's sort of even more scary, because if I had used this computer for all my stuff that had important files on it and I corrupted the BIOS, there's not even any way I could have gotten those files off, because I couldn't have transferred the drive to another computer. It's actually soldered onto the drive. I don't even know what I would have done. Maybe you could potentially send it to a data recovery specialist that could have put the chip onto their own motherboard, who knows? So in the end, this sort of ended up being a worst case scenario example. I was not able to figure out how to recover the BIOS. It's just a dead computer now, and if I needed those files off it, well, there's not really any way for me to get it easily. I have no idea why the BIOS recovery did not work. Maybe if I had run it within Windows, it actually would have written the backup copy to the EFI partition that it could have used, but I don't know. It seems like it was running the recovery program, it just was crashing or something while it was happening, so it might not have even worked in that case. I guess if this wasn't just a demo, my only recourse would have been to literally send in the computer to HP to have them try and reflash the BIOS and fix it, or even just try to do it myself. But not exactly the ideal situation. And this just goes to show why you do need to be very careful when updating the BIOS. Before you do it, be very sure you look up all the potential backup methods you have if you do need to do some kind of recovery or rescue of the BIOS. This may be, again, a backup dual BIOS or something, or the best bet would probably be if your motherboard has both a dual BIOS and another recovery option, just in case. But hopefully, in any case, you'll now be much more familiar with updating the BIOS the next time you find you may have to. Let me know down in the comments if you might have any stories from updating the BIOS. Maybe you had one that got corrupted and went completely wrong, or maybe you're like me, where you've never actually had any issues when updating the BIOS, except this one right here that I demoed. Also, if you like this video, be sure to subscribe. I make new videos every week, so it should be worth it. If you guys want to keep watching, the next video I'd recommend is one where I was talking about OLED displays, and specifically, what does the organic in organic LED actually mean? I went into some super detailed science. Should be very interesting if you've ever wondered about screen displays and stuff like that. So definitely check that out. I'll put the link right there. Thanks so much for watching, guys. I'll see you in the next video.